The fluorescent lights hummed their constant mechanical prayer above Elena Martinez as she folded the oncology linens at 11:47 on Thursday night, each corner creased with the precision of someone who'd spent 17 years learning that details meant survival. Her hands moved with surgical efficiency, smooth, economical, the tremor barely visible unless you knew to look for it, and nobody at Seattle General in San Diego knew to look. The linens came off the cart in practice sequence: fitted sheet, flat sheet, pillowcase, blanket. Fold. Crease. Stack. The fabric was warm from the industrial dryer, carrying the antiseptic smell of hospital-grade detergent that never quite masked the smell underneath, the smell of sickness and fear and desperate hope all pressed into cotton. She was alone on the third-floor oncology ward. The patients slept behind closed doors, their 4 lines dripping medications that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Elena knew the inventory of every cart on this floor down to the milligram. She'd memorized the drug protocols not out of nursing school requirement but out of habit, the same habit that made her catalog exits and estimate response times and notice which security cameras had blind spots. 16 years of special forces training didn't simply switch off when you traded a combat uniform for scrubs. It just went quiet. Dormant. Waiting. The med room door stood open down the corridor, its lock mechanism broken for 3 weeks now. She'd reported it twice and received apologies both times but no repair. She carried her stack of folded linens toward the storage closet, moving with the kind of practice silence that came from learning, in Helmand Province, that noise could get you killed. The corridor stretched before her under the humming lights, empty and still as a held breath. That was when she saw him. Dr. Ashford stood at the medication cart in the med room, his back to her, his hands moving with deliberate precision as he transferred vials from the locked compartment into his leather medical bag. Elena's vision sharpened, that autonomic response she couldn't control, the same response that had kept her alive through 3 deployments when IEDs detonated 200 meters from her position. She noted details with the efficiency of a threat assessment. The vials were chemotherapy medications. Expensive ones. Salvage protocol medications that cost the hospital $17,000 per course of treatment. He was replacing them with saline. Clear saline in identical vials, the kind nobody would notice until the patient's white cell count didn't respond and precious days were lost. She should have walked past. Should have pretended she saw nothing, reported it through proper channels, let the system handle the system. That was what a person with a clean record would do. That was what someone without 17 years of classified operations experience would choose. Elena didn't move. Dr. Ashford's hand stilled. He turned with the kind of deliberate slowness that communicated absolute control, his eyes locking onto hers across the 15 feet of empty corridor. His expression shifted, surprise gave way to calculation in the span of 2 heartbeats. He was taloning himself, assessing her the same way she was assessing him, and in that moment she understood with absolute clarity that he was determining whether she was a threat or an obstacle. Whether she was someone who could be managed or someone who needed to be eliminated. His eyes were the color of wet cement. His smile didn't reach them. He closed the medical bag with a soft click, the sound carrying in the empty hallway like a punctuation mark. He moved toward her with unhurried confidence, the kind of confidence that came from knowing you had institutional power, the kind that came from years of colleagues looking away when you needed them to. As he passed her shoulder, he deliberately let his arm brush hers, a physical assertion of dominance so casual it was almost courteous. "Evening, Lena," he said, his voice smooth as motor oil. "Late night." Elena's hand moved on its own to the jacket pocket where she kept it, the faded unit patch from her last operation before everything changed. Tan canvas with embroidered thread, worn thin by her fingers over the past 18 months of nights exactly like this one. Her fingers found it the way a rosary finds your hand in crisis. The tactile memory of it centered her, brought her back from the edge of something dangerous. She took one measured breath. The kind of breath they'd taught her in the 75th Ranger Regiment, the kind that reset your nervous system and steadied your aim and cleared your mind when the world was trying to kill you. The oxygen traveled down into her lungs and back out, a reminder that she was alive, that she was still functional, that the 17 years since she'd been ordered to disappear hadn't erased what she was underneath the scrubs. She'd been Major Elena Martinez then. She'd led the extraction team that pulled a high-value target out of Sanjan Valley in Helmand Province during a sandstorm so thick you couldn't see your weapon in front of your face. 8 soldiers had come out. 8 soldiers had come home. The Pentagon had classified every file, scrubbed every record, and given her an order that still echoed in her head during dark moments like this: you will not surface. You will not use your skills. You will not exist again. You will disappear, Major, and you will stay disappeared. That was 1,847 days ago. She'd been a ghost since then, moving through hospitals like a spectre, folding linens and restocking carts and maintaining inventory that nobody checked because who noticed the quiet nurse? Who saw past the tremor in her hands when she drew blood? Who understood that the surgical precision in her movements came from something more than diligence? Dr. Ashford disappeared into the stairwell, his footsteps echoing down the concrete steps in diminishing thuds. Elena stood alone in the medroom corridor, her fingers still touching the unit patch through the fabric of her jacket. The embroidered insignia of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse, pressed against her palm like a pulse check, like proof that the major she'd been was still buried somewhere under the nurse she'd become. She didn't know that Dr. Ashford was already planning his countermeasure, already calculating how to neutralize a potential witness. She didn't know that the medication swap was part of something larger, something that had been operating in the blind spots of the hospital's oversight for 18 months, something that would end with families broken and medical board stunned and her own carefully constructed disappearance suddenly, catastrophically compromised. She only knew that she'd seen something she couldn't unsee, and that the carefully constructed identity of a ghost was about to become complicated in ways she couldn't yet calculate. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that in 6 hours, a man who'd survived 2 IED detonations and the shrapnel that still lived in his chest would collapse outside this very hospital's emergency room, broken and bleeding and desperate, and 20 physicians would walk past him like he didn't exist. 20 doctors. She would count each refusal. She would watch each one turn away from a soldier who'd given everything and had nothing left to offer except his suffering. And she would understand, in that moment, that some orders were meant to be broken. For now, Elena folded the linens in her hands, placed them on the shelf with the same care she'd used to assemble her false identity, and walked back to the ward. The lights hummed their mechanical prayer. The 4 lines dripped their expensive medications, the real ones, still intact, still whole. She touched the unit patch one more time, fingertips pressing against the embroidered soldiers she'd brought home from Helmand Province, the ones whose names were classified and whose stories were buried and whose sacrifice had earned her the right to disappear. She had 17 more minutes on her shift. Then she would go home to an apartment with no photographs on the walls and no evidence of a life that had ever been lived. She would sit on her fire escape and feel the San Diego night air cool against her skin, and she would try not to think about how long a person could remain invisible before the invisibility started to suffocate her. 12 more hours until the veteran collapsed. 12 hours until everything changed. Friday morning arrived like any other, except it didn't. Elena clocked in at 5:48 a.m., same as always, scrub still damp from the rain outside, boots squeaking on linoleum that never quite dried. The night shift had been routine, med passes, vitals, 1 patient who coded and came back. She'd finished charting by 6:30 when the nosebleed started. Just stress. Just the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical song and the altitude of staying invisible. She'd pinched the bridge of her nose for 7 minutes, tilted her head back like a civilian, and by 6:43 the bleeding stopped. By 6:45, it didn't matter anymore. The overhead page crackled to life with a voice that wasn't human, it was institutional, impersonal, designed to reach every corner of the building simultaneously. Lena the Bleeder to Station 3. Lena the Bleeder, clean up on Station 3. The nickname hit first. Then the laughter. It started in Trauma Bay and rippled outward like fire across dry grass. Elena kept her hand steady as she set down the chart. Took 1 measured breath. The day shift was arriving for handoff, and every single one of them had heard it. 12 staff members clustered near the nurse's station, eyes bright with the kind of malicious joy that hospitals bred like bacteria. They didn't bother looking away when she passed. Dr. Ashford stood against the wall opposite, arms crossed, watching her reaction with the precision of a hunter timing a kill shot. She walked to Station 3 with measured steps, 1 breath per stride. The counter had a small smear of blood on it, not even hers, not from her nosebleed, but it didn't matter. She wiped it clean with a paper towel, methodical, thorough, while 12 staff members pretended not to watch her. One nurse whispered something to another. A resident smirked. Elena wiped the counter a second time. There was no blood left. She wiped it a third time anyway. It was something to do with her hands that wasn't trembling. It was something to do besides acknowledge that a major in the United States Army Special Forces was now Lena the Bleeder, a joke whispered across a hospital floor. She returned to her station and documented the incident in the patient log. Epistaxis, resolved, patient stable. No mention of the sound the page made when it broadcast her humiliation. No mention of the laughter. No mention of Dr. Ashford's smile. At 2:15 p.m., she was restocking the supply closet on the 4th floor, fours, gauze, catheter kits, when the door closed behind her. Dr. Ashford didn't announce himself. She felt him first as a change in air pressure, that subtle shift that predators carry with them. He stood 3 inches from her face, close enough that she could smell his cologne, close enough that he could see the exact moment she realized this wasn't a casual conversation. His voice came out surgical calm, each word a scalpel. You saw something you shouldn't have seen. He let that hang in the recirculated air. I made calls. 3 of them. You'll be transferred to county intake by Monday. You'll never work healthcare again in this city. Not here. Not anywhere anyone respects credentials. He paused, let the scope of the threat expand. Not if you understand. Elena took 1 measured breath. The kind of breath paramedics train for when everything is collapsing. She didn't nod. She kept her eyes level with his, steady as a laser, and in that moment a single tear escaped her left eye. Not from fear. Not from breaking. Tears were just fluid. Saline. Chemistry. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, 1 smooth motion, her hand steady as it had been 1,000 times before when she held lives together on a surgical table. You'll remember this moment differently than I will, she said. Her voice was quiet. That was the dangerous part. Not loud. Not defiant. Just certain. The kind of certainty that comes from having already survived worse, from having already lost everything and walked out the other side still breathing. He didn't have a response prepared for quiet certainty. He had responses for tears, for begging, for the kind of breaking that makes sense to a man like him. He smiled instead, a thin, predatory thing, stepped back, and opened the door. The hallway beyond was empty. That was worse than laughter. That was the sound of people with enough institutional sense to not witness what happened in supply closets. By 5:50 p.m., the arriving night shift was clustering around their cars in the parking lot, and Elena was walking toward hers when Dr. Ashford intercepted her with a hospital administrator, a woman named Patterson who carried a tablet and the exhausted expression of someone who'd made this particular walk before. Effective immediately, you're reassigned to sanitation duty, night shift, building maintenance, Patterson said, reading from the screen without making eye contact. Badge access restricted to service areas only. You'll report to maintenance at 11:44 p.m. She held out a new badge. The old one, the one that opened patient care areas, the one that made her a nurse, Patterson kept in her other hand. A kept thing. A taken thing. Elena reached for the new badge. Her hand didn't shake. She clipped it to her scrubs, the plastic cold against her fingers, and she felt rather than saw Dr. Ashford watching for the break, the moment when the mask slipped, when the sanitation worker admitted she was just a sanitation worker, when the humiliation became real and internal and owned. A second tear tracked down her cheek. Just one. She wiped it with the back of her hand, turned to face the cluster of arriving staff members who were pretending not to watch. I'll do whatever work needs doing, she said. Her voice carried across the parking lot like a command, like something that had been trained into muscle and bone. 23 staff members looked away simultaneously. Even Patterson flinched. Dr. Ashford's smile widened because he didn't recognize what he'd just heard, the sound of a woman who'd already sacrificed everything, who had nothing left to protect and therefore nothing left to lose. Elena walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for 4 minutes with her hands on the steering wheel, breathing like a combat medic counting down from 10. Her phone was in her pocket, the one she'd purchased with cash at a CVS for years ago, the one that no one knew existed. She pulled it out. Photographed Dr. Ashford's medication cart, the one she'd documented for 6 months, the expensive drug swapped for saline, the pattern so clear and systematic that even Patterson would have to see it. The photos were sharp. The timestamps embedded. She sent them to an encrypted email address she hadn't used in 3 years, the one that forwarded directly to federal investigators, the one that connected to an office in Washington where people still remembered her name, even though she was supposed to forget it. She clocked out at 6:13 p.m. The badge reader didn't recognize her new credentials yet. She had to wait for a paramedic to open the secure door. He nodded at her, recognition, sympathy, the kind of kindness that hospital staff offered to the invisible. She thanked him with her eyes. That was all she had left to give. That was all she would give until midnight, until the next shift started, until the old veteran collapsed outside the ER with wounds that reminded her exactly why some wars never ended. What she didn't know was that 16 hours away, a man with a blue tarp tied to his body and shrapnel migrating through his chest cavity was in a taxi headed toward Seattle General. She didn't know that by 11:20 p.m., 20 doctors would walk past him. She didn't know that her hands would remember things her brain had been ordered to forget. She didn't know that saving a life and losing everything would happen in the same breath, in the same night, on the same concrete where Dr. Ashford had just promised her disappearance. The mop handle felt light in her hands. Muscle memory made the motions automatic: push, drag, ring, push again. 11:42 at night. The ambulance bay service entrance smelled like diesel exhaust and rain that had just finished hammering the concrete. Elena moved through her new assignment with the same precision she'd applied to everything else: corners swept clean, grout lines scrubbed white, floors so polished they reflected the sodium vapor lights above. Just a janitor now. Just sanitation staff. She'd worn that title for 14 hours and it fit like a borrowed uniform, uncomfortable, temporary, borrowed from someone else's life. The bucket she pushed had a dent in it shaped like a fist. She'd noticed it because noticing details was a survival skill that didn't vanish when they took your badge. Dr. Ashford had made sure everyone knew her trajectory. 1 shift ago she'd been a trauma nurse. Now she pushed mop water across concrete that reflected her own image back at her, warped and broken. The sirens hit at 11:58. Not one siren. 2. Racing each other down Harbor Drive, getting closer, the sound growing from a distant wail into something physical, the kind of sound that changed air pressure, that made animals run. Elena's hand stilled on the mop. Instinct. Pure instinct. Her body recognized urgency before her conscious mind caught up. The sirens belonged to paramedics transporting a patient who needed this hospital right now. The sirens belonged to someone in crisis. The sirens belonged to someone who was about to need doctors. The taxi pulled in hard at 12:04, driver's door opened before it fully stopped. An older man, late 50s, maybe 60s, it was hard to tell under the dirt and the weight of someone's final days, fell sideways out of the back seat. His body hit the concrete with the sound of something breaking. Not screaming. Not moving. Just the absolute deadweight thud of a man whose body had already begun its surrender. Seizing. Elena saw the muscle contractions rippling across his arms, the back of his head striking asphalt, the foam at the corner of his mouth catching the white emergency lights. Infected shrapnel wounds. She could see them even from 30 feet away, the angry red tracks up his left leg, the bandages wrapped with something that looked like electrical tape, the smell of infected tissue carried on wind that smelled like coming rain. Disabled veteran. She knew it before the paramedics even said it, the way his movements held the particular fracture pattern of someone whose body had been reassembled incorrectly after being broken in violence. She watched. Just watched. It wasn't her job anymore. Dr. Ashford emerged from the automatic doors at 12:06, moving with the confident stride of a man who owned the ground he walked on. His eyes assessed the patient in exactly 4 seconds, the uninsured calculation, the liability equation, the risk-benefit analysis that turned flesh into spreadsheet columns. He didn't kneel. He didn't order a stretcher. He turned to the paramedics with the kind of calm that came from having destroyed someone's career for hours earlier and felt nothing. Insurance card? Identification? The paramedic, a woman with grey threading through her ponytail, eyes that had seen worse, shook her head. Nothing. He was found 3 blocks away. Discharged or abandoned, we think. Multiple infected wounds, altered mental status, possible thoracic involvement. Ashford's jaw tightened. Not with compassion. With calculation. We're at capacity. Trauma bays 1 through 4 are occupied. Our wound care unit is booked 3 weeks out. This patient requires complex intervention, specialized beds, and significant resources. The liability exposure alone, he paused, his voice dropping into something colder. We can't accept this admission. Hospital policy is clear on uninsured patients with acute complications. The liability is catastrophic. Policy requires. He's seizing, doctor. He needs a bed. Then call Mercy General. Call county. This is not our responsibility. Ashford turned and walked back through the automatic doors without waiting for a response. The doors sighed shut behind him like they were relieved to close. The first refusal. Elena counted. 1. The senior resident came next, called down by the paramedics who were still trying. She had kind eyes and tired shoulders, and she looked at the veteran the way you looked at something you wished you could unsee. His situation is complicated, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word. With no insurance, with wounds this severe, with the need for infectious disease consult and possibly ICU beds, we just can't manage the financial exposure right now. She went back inside. 2. Then came the orthopedic surgeon who said the leg fractures were beyond our department's scope. 3. The surgical attending who said capacity constraints. 4. A hospitalist who said the wound care requirements exceed current staffing. 5. Another resident, younger, maybe 2 years out of medical school, who looked like she wanted to help but looked more afraid of something else, someone else, and her eyes went to the ceiling as if Dr. Ashford was watching from above. 6. An emergency physician who said this requires level 1 trauma designation and I'm not comfortable. 7. Elena stopped counting by the time the 8th physician walked past. She knew how this ended. She'd seen it before. Not here. In Helmand Province, after her team extracted the high-value target from the compound in Sanjin Valley, after she'd watched the military contracting officers load unmarked cases and shredded documents into a Chinook helicopter at 0230 hours, she'd sat with a wounded Afghan interpreter in a makeshift casualty station. The doctors, if you could call them that, had been rotating, and each one had looked at him with the exact same expression: calculation, fear, self-preservation. He died at 0300 while she held his hand. They'd called it insufficient resources. They'd called it triage. But he'd been her responsibility. This man was everyone's responsibility and no one's at all. By 1221, she'd watched 19 physicians refuse, defer, decline, redirect, or simply walk past. 19 human beings who'd sworn an oath. 19 doctors. And counting. The 20th was now approaching from the ICU corridor, his badge dangling from a lanyard, his face arranged in the expression of someone who'd already made a decision before he got the question. Elena dropped the mop. It fell like a rifle, straight, clean, hitting tile with a crack that echoed across the ambulance bay. She moved toward the concrete where the veteran was still seizing, still bleeding, still dying. Her knees hit the ground hard enough that the pain registered and filed itself away under information instead of injury. Pain was data. Pain meant you were still alive. Her hands moved on their own. She'd trained for this 11,000 times in her career, but this wasn't training. This was muscle memory that lived deeper than thought, that operated on protocols written in blood and desert dust. Her fingers found the gap between his ribs, fourth intercostal space, mid-axillary line, and her hand closed around his chest. She could feel the tension pneumothorax underneath her palm like a second heartbeat that wanted to kill him. His right lung had collapsed under the pressure of air trapped in his chest cavity, air that had nowhere to escape, building pressure until his heart couldn't beat properly. Pressure like a fist closing. Pressure like a sentence. She had an idea. Her left hand reached into the cargo pocket of her scrubs where she'd kept a crumpled MRE wrapper from 2019, from a tactical medical course she wasn't supposed to have taken, from a training that didn't exist on any civilian record. The metallic package was still there, the way she kept it, the way other people kept lucky coins. She tore it with her teeth, the copper taste of the foil coating her tongue, and pressed the smooth side against his chest, covering the gap she'd created with her fingers. The seal was immediate. Not perfect. But enough. Enough to let the trapped air escape, to let the pressure equalize, to let his right lung begin its hesitant reinflation. 2 large bore 4s. Start them now. The paramedics moved. It wasn't a request. It was a command deployed in the voice of someone who'd managed a 20-soldier rapid deployment under fire in Helmand Province and lived to debrief it. Voices like that didn't get questioned. They got obeyed. Lactated ringers. Wide open. Both lines. The bags were hanging in 30 seconds. Elena's hands never stopped. She found his neck, her fingers identifying the landmarks of his carotid, measuring blood pressure by feel, already getting weaker. Compensatory shock. The body's final mathematics. What's his oxygen saturation? 88 on supplemental, a paramedic said. Get me a non-rebreather. Full oxygen flow. His chest was rising again. Actually rising. The seal was holding. She could feel it under her hand, the tiny electrical signals of a lung remembering how to breathe, the microscopic adjustment of his rib cage as it shifted from rigid to compliant again. 12 minutes had passed. 14. 17. We need to move, another paramedic said. Surgical resident is prepping OR2. Elena didn't ask who changed the order. She already knew. She'd heard the word major in someone's voice as they'd called up to the operating room, and the room had cleared, and the resident had stopped calculating liability and started calculating how to save a life. It didn't matter. She was off the clock anyway. She sat back on her heels, hands slick with blood that wasn't hers and was hers because some wounds were collective. Her scrubs were soaked through. Her lip was bleeding where she'd bitten through it during the 17 minutes of keeping a stranger alive on concrete while the rest of the medical staff had counted the reasons not to. 20 doctors had counted. 1 nurse had counted to different numbers: blood pressure drops, oxygen improvement, time remaining, survival probability. Dr. Ashford stood at the edge of the ambulance bay, watching her with eyes that had gone very still and very calculating. She could see the moment he understood what had happened. Not just the medical intervention. The authority. The muscle memory that moved like it had spent thousands of hours in operating rooms and field tents and military transport helicopters. The hands that belonged to someone trained for this, paid for this, built for this. His phone was already out. By 1:15 in the morning, she was being escorted out by a security guard who apologized the way people did when they were following orders that felt wrong. Her clinic access had been revoked within the hour. Her badge was deactivated. Her locker was being cleared into a cardboard box by someone who wasn't her, the contents of her 17 years at Seattle General being inventoried like evidence at a crime scene. She followed the security guard down the hallway past the nursing station where 3 colleagues pretended to chart. Their eyes found her face for exactly 1 second before returning to their screens. In Helmand Province, after her team had extracted the high-value target, a military contractor with documents that proved fraud, that proved theft, that proved the operation itself was being bankrolled by people who didn't exist, her entire unit had been debriefed by officers who'd used the words classified beyond top secret and your identities will be redacted and you will never speak of this again. She'd been Major Elena Martinez then, with a service record and a name and a security clearance that got her into rooms where only the most dangerous truths lived. They'd taken that. They'd erased her. Told her disappearance was the price of her loyalty. And she'd paid it. The cardboard box held her stethoscope, her personal pen, the unit patch from her first deployment sewn into the lining of her jacket, the faded insignia of 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, the men she'd saved and the men she'd lost and the oath she'd sworn to keep. The security guard set it down in front of her. She picked it up and walked out into the San Diego night where it had started raining again, where the water hammered down like applause or judgment, where she was nobody again. Disappear, they told her. And then she'd stood on concrete in front of 20 doctors and a dying soldier and she'd stopped disappearing. Dr. Ashford found her in the corridor 17 minutes later, his dress shoes clicking against tile with the precision of a man who'd already calculated his next move. She was still wearing the gloves, still moving with the fluid competence of someone whose hands remembered things her mouth would never say. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough to dominate, far enough to appear reasonable. His eyes were cold calculation. That was incredibly reckless, he said. Not angry. Worse. Clinical. You performed advanced medical intervention without physician oversight. You didn't consult me. You didn't follow protocol. Elena pulled off her gloves without answering, peeling them back 1 finger at a time. The sound they made was like skin shedding. Do you understand what you've done? His voice dropped lower, the tone of a man explaining consequences to a child. You've exposed this hospital to massive liability. A homeless patient with no insurance, no identification, no next of kin. You stabilized someone we collectively decided was outside our scope of care. That decision wasn't yours to make. She balled the gloves into her palm. Still silent. You're finished here. He said it the way you'd tell someone the weather forecast. Facts. Inevitable. Already decided. I'm making 3 calls. First to the hospital board citing dangerous unsupervised medical intervention. Second to our risk management officer. Third to the state licensing board. By morning, your clinic access will be revoked. Your badge will be deactivated. Your locker will be cleared by security. Elena met his eyes. Didn't speak. You made a choice tonight, Dr. Ashford continued, his voice like a blade drawn across silk. You chose a vagrant over your career. Over your future. Over the institution that employed you. He turned toward the administrative wing, then paused without looking back. Security will escort you from the building within the hour. Don't make this difficult. She stood in the empty corridor for 40 seconds after he left, listening to his footsteps fade into silence. The fluorescent lights above buzzed their constant white noise hymn. Somewhere down the hallway, monitors beeped. Someone's for pump chimed. The hospital continued its rhythmic breathing, indifferent to the destruction of a single nurse. The 3 calls took 17 minutes. She knew because she could hear him through the administrative office door, his voice rising and falling with practiced outrage, his words cutting surgical incisions through her employment record, dangerous, unsupervised, protocol violation, liability, 20 physicians made a collective clinical judgment she overrode. The narrative was clean. Brilliant, even. He turned her act of mercy into evidence of incompetence. Security arrived at 1:38 a.m., 2 officers in grey uniforms who looked embarrassed to be escorting a nurse in bloody scrubs out of the building. They didn't touch her, didn't speak. They simply walked beside her, neutral and thorough, as if presence alone was enough. Her clinic access card was deactivated before she reached the staff locker room. The badge reader flashed red when she tried to swipe, a small electronic rejection that felt heavier than any dismissal letter. She changed clothes in the locker room, moving with the same precision she'd used to seal a pneumothorax. Each motion deliberate. Each fold intentional. The staff locker room smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness of air that cycled through industrial ventilation systems. Her shoes, still damp with the veteran's blood, left faint rust-colored marks on the tile floor that someone would clean tomorrow. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing her locker wouldn't be cleared by someone else. They'd send security to do it after she was gone, dumping her personal items into a cardboard box and sealing it with evidence tape. She had maybe 20 minutes before they'd ask her to surrender her badge completely. 20 minutes to empty a locker she'd filled across for years of night shifts, for years of living a ghost of a life in the civilian world, for years of pretending to be someone she wasn't. Elena walked deeper into the hospital's infrastructure, past the main locker room toward the staff laundry facility in the basement. The card reader there hadn't been updated yet. Her deactivated badge still opened the door, a 3-second lag that felt like mercy. The laundry room was empty at 2:40 a.m. on a Sunday, just industrial washers humming their mechanical prayer and the smell of bleach lead thick enough to coat her lungs. She pulled her dirty scrubs from her locker, top, bottom, the white jacket that had kept her anonymous for 1,461 days of night shifts. They smelled like floor cleaner and the phantom scent of copper she couldn't quite wash out. She moved to the folding station, an old stainless steel table scarred with water rings and chemical stains, and began to fold. Hospital corners first. The technique her mother had taught her 43 years ago, before Elena had any idea what corners meant. The scrub pants folded twice, then thirds, the legs lined up with geometric precision. The motion was muscle memory worn into the deep part of her cerebellum, the part that didn't care whether she was making a hospital bed or disappearing from her own life. The top came next. She laid it flat, arms crossed at the wrists the way nurses fold scrubs when they're meant to disappear, meant to be identical to every other scrub in every other hospital laundry room across America. Blue becoming rectangle. Identity becoming inventory. Her jacket last. The sleeve she pulled smooth, the fabric slightly stiff from dried sweat and the chemical spray they used to sanitize oars. And there, when she folded the left side back, the unit patch her hands found without thinking, 3rd Special Forces Group. Helmand Province. 2 inches of faded embroidery that said everything her for years of silence had concealed. She pressed her fingers against it through the fabric. 1 breath. 2. The veteran was upstairs in ICU, his wound sutured by a trauma surgeon who'd arrived at 2:15 a.m., who'd read the preliminary field report and called Elena directly to say, "You saved his life on that concrete. 20 minutes longer and he doesn't survive transport." The trauma surgeon had been efficient, thorough, and had not asked why the patient arrived with field-grade medical intervention when 20 physicians had initially refused him. But Elena knew what happened to homeless patients in county hospitals. She'd worked 3 years in the VA system before she'd been ordered to disappear. She knew the statistics, infection rates, follow-up care gaps, the particular way the system failed people with no insurance and no family to advocate. She'd saved his life on concrete and then her firing had ensured she couldn't help him further, couldn't monitor his wounds or catch the sepsis before it rooted deep or make sure he took the antibiotics or had somewhere to go after discharge. She'd traded his future for her unemployment. The scrubs went into the return bin at 2:58 a.m., 3 identical sets of blue folded with hospital corners, anonymous and indistinguishable from every other set that would cycle back through the sterilization system and into another nurse's locker. Her jacket went on top, the unit patch folding inward, hidden again. Elena stood at the laundry room sink for 90 seconds, running cold water over her hands, watching the faint rust stain swirl down the drain. The water was so cold it hurt. She let it hurt. Pain was information. Pain was the only honest thing left. Her deactivated badge opened the service exit one last time at 3:16 a.m. The ambulance bay was empty except for the evidence of crisis, scattered gloves, a toppled for stand, and on the concrete where she dropped to her knees, a dark stain that looked black under the parking lot lights. She stood looking at it for 10 seconds, long enough to memorize its exact shape. "You'll remember this moment differently than I will," she'd told Dr. Ashford during the parking lot demotion. She'd been wrong. She'd remember this moment exactly. Every detail. Every surface. Every second of the distance between saving a life and destroying her own. She drove away from Seattle General as the city's pre-dawn light began to bleed across the eastern sky, her hand steady on the wheel, her eyes tracking the empty streets of San Diego with the tactical awareness of someone who'd spent 20 years learning how to move through hostile territory. The veteran would survive the next 72 hours, she was certain enough about that. After 72 hours, infection rates climbed. After a week, system failure became probable. After 2 weeks, unless someone who understood his wounds was watching him, he'd become another statistic in the gap between medical care and human survival. She didn't know that in 14 hours, a routine database integration for emergency care documentation would flag her name in a system that should never have contained it. She didn't know her classified security clearance was about to surface in a Pentagon archive during a background check for a homeless veteran with no family. She didn't know that saving one soldier would resurrect the past she'd been ordered to bury, or that the military that had erased her would have to watch as she became impossible to ignore. But she knew, as the sun rose and San Diego woke around her, that she'd made the only choice available to someone trained to save lives. She'd stopped disappearing. She just hadn't known yet that the cost of that choice was nothing compared to what would happen next. 2 days later, routine systems check. Automated background verification running on every employee hired in the last 36 months. The VA integration algorithm flagged something it wasn't supposed to flag, a classified security clearance buried 7 layers deep in Pentagon infrastructure, attached to a night shift nurse at Seattle General who mopped floors and said nothing. The clearance wasn't supposed to exist in civilian databases. The name attached to it was supposed to be permanently erased. Elena Martinez. Major. Army Special Forces. Witness Protection Designation Alpha 7, embedded in healthcare to maintain operational obscurity. Except someone, somewhere, had buried the file incorrectly, and machines are thorough. They don't forget. The hospital administrator, Patricia Chen, opened the email at 8:13 a.m. Monday morning and read the same file Elena had spent for years pretending didn't exist. Her hand shook as she dialed the Pentagon direct line. 23 minutes later, the line connected through 4 separate security protocols to someone who identified himself only as a liaison officer. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's her." "Is she secure?" By 10:15 a.m., the military knew Elena's cover had been breached. By 11:11 a.m., a decision was made. By 2:36 p.m., the veteran's grown daughter, Maria Santos, 34, wearing a navy blazer and eyes that held the same exhaustion Elena recognized from Helmand Province, walked into Seattle General carrying a military liaison's briefing packet. She entered the hospital room where Elena stood reviewing discharge paperwork, not knowing that her father had already spoken to a lawyer, not knowing that he'd called his daughter the moment the hospital's social worker mentioned the woman who knelt on concrete while 20 doctors walked away. Maria's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Major Elena Martinez, she read aloud, voice cracking. United States Army Special Forces. The clipboard one of the nurses was holding clattered to the floor like a gunshot. Silence. The kind of silence that fills a room when reality inverts itself. Elena didn't move. Didn't react. Her hands remained steady as they'd been for 18 years, muscle memory and discipline the only things keeping her in the present moment while something in her past, something she'd been ordered to bury, rose to the surface like a body in deep water. Maria continued reading, voice breaking over each line. Bronze Star with Valor. She paused. Elena's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Silver Star. The room held its breath. 2 Purple Hearts. A nurse who'd worked 3 shifts with Elena without knowing her name began to cry. Maria's voice wavered. Commendation Medal for Valor. Meritorious Service Medal. Joint Service Medal. 6 medals. 6 moments. 6 reminders that someone had kept count of what Elena had tried to forget. And then the door opened. The man who entered wore civilian clothes but moved like he was still in full combat gear, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the room with the precise focus of someone who'd cleared rooms in the dark at 120 miles per hour. SEAL Team 3 patch barely visible on his worn leather jacket. His name was Hal Graves, call sign Breaker, and he'd been Elena's combat controller for 7 months in San Jin Valley. He'd called extraction coordinates from her position under fire. She'd brought him home with a shattered left arm and a bullet lodged 2 centimeters from his spine. "Major," he said, and the word carried 17 years of silence. "I'm here to tell them the names." He walked to the center of the room. Corporal Justin Webb. Sergeant First Class David Marino. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Hastings. Captain Ryan Kelly. Master Sergeant Thomas Wright. Petty Officer First Class Luis Rodriguez. Sergeant Miguel Santos. He nodded to Maria, "Your father." 8 men in Helmand Province. 8 men who came home because of her. His voice didn't crack. SEAL voices don't crack. Every mission. Every extraction. Every soldier you brought back. We counted. The hospital fell away. The machines, the fluorescent lights, the antiseptic smell of careful endings, all of it became background noise to the sound of names being spoken aloud by someone who'd lived them. An FBI agent entered quietly, standing near the door with the particular gravity of federal authority. Major Martinez was embedded in civilian life, he said, his voice cutting through the cascade of recognition, as part of a witness protection arrangement. In 2019, she documented systematic military contracting fraud worth approximately $847 million. Defense contractor shell corporations, inflated invoicing, payoffs to procurement officers. Major Martinez gathered evidence for 18 months and reported it to the Inspector General. Rather than face investigation, the contracting ring had connections. They threatened to kill her entire unit. The Army relocated her to the civilian sector under a new identity for mutual protection. She was ordered never to surface, never to use her skills, never to exist again. Dr. Ashford stood in the corner, his smirk dissolving like tissue in water. His face drained of color so completely that for a moment he looked like a man watching his own funeral. The agent turned to him. "We're also aware of your activities, Dr. Ashford. Systematic theft of oncology medications from Seattle General's pharmaceutical inventory. Replacement with saline. Patient endangerment for financial gain." Major Martinez submitted photographic evidence to our office on Friday morning at 6:23 a.m. Timestamped. Verified. Every photograph, every medication substitution, every patient chart corresponding to stolen drugs. 72 hours of federal investigation, and we have 23 documented cases. But that wasn't the worst part for Ashford. Not yet. He made a decision that would define the next 6 hours of his life, a strategic miscalculation born of desperation and pride. At 4:15 p.m., he called Channel 7 News. Requested an emergency evening broadcast interview. "I need to respond to allegations," he told the news director, "before they destroy my reputation." He convinced them he had evidence, documents, hospital protocol violations. The anchor agreed. Primetime Monday evening. 6:13 p.m. For million viewers in the Southern California region tuning in for the evening news. By 5:24 p.m., Ashford had written his narrative, "A Rogue Nurse, Protocols Violated, Patient Safety Endangered, Medication Fraud Accusations Designed to Cover Her Incompetence." He would frame Elena as mentally unstable, desperate for attention, a security risk. He would weaponize her silence against her. At 6:27 p.m., he sat in the studio under lighting that made him look confident, and he began to speak. "What I witnessed on Friday night was deeply troubling," he said, voice measured like a man talking about a patient's bad decisions. A nurse acting without authorization, using improvised equipment, no medical supervision, materials from her personal bag. The hospital's existing protocols exist for patient safety. When those protocols are violated, even with good intentions, we endanger the people we serve. The anchor nodded sympathetically. Ashford gained momentum, confidence rebuilding with each sentence. This individual has claimed to be helping, but what she actually did was practice medicine without a license, endangering. The studio phone lit up. The producer in Ashford's earpiece said something. The anchor touched her ear and interrupted. "Dr. Ashford, we have a caller. General James Matteson, United States Army, appears to be calling from the Pentagon." The blood drained from Ashford's face a second time, more completely. On screen, millions of people watched it happen. The general's voice filled the studio like winter filling a house through broken windows. Cold. Precise. Absolutely without mercy. I'm watching your interview, Doctor. The woman you're discrediting is Major Elena Martinez, one of the most decorated soldiers I've had the honor to serve with. She saved 12 men in Helmand Province using the exact field medicine you're calling reckless. She conducted emergency medical interventions under direct fire, in resource-denied environments, with nothing but her training and her will. The field medicine that saved Master Sergeant Chen's life on Friday night, the improvised chest seal, the tension pneumothorax management, is identical to procedures she performed with zero equipment in combat zones at 17,000 feet elevation. The anchor leaned forward. General, can you? But the general wasn't finished. I can also confirm that Major Martinez submitted photographic evidence to federal investigators documenting your systematic theft of oncology medications, replacement with saline, and patient endangerment for personal profit. The FBI has been building a case for 72 hours. That evidence, Doctor, was provided by a woman who mopped floors at your hospital rather than use her rank or credentials to demand respect. That's the character you're attacking on live television in front of 4 million people. The studio fell into a silence so complete you could hear the air conditioning hum. Ashford's face had gone the color of spoiled meat. His hand shook as he reached for the water glass. Spilled it. The anchor watched him with the particular interest of someone realizing they'd given primetime television to a man collapsing in real time. Dr. Ashford, the anchor said carefully, do you have a response? He stood abruptly, fingers fumbling with his microphone. Tore it off. Walked off the set. The camera followed him for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for millions of people to see a man's entire career ending in the space between his chair and the studio exit. By 8:33 p.m., the hospital board had suspended him with cause. By 9:36 p.m., federal agents were at his home with a search warrant. By Tuesday morning, his medical license was under emergency suspension pending investigation. By Wednesday, federal charges had been filed: medication fraud, insurance fraud, patient endangerment, conspiracy to defraud the United States government of controlled substances. 6 months later, Elena Martinez sat in an office that overlooked the same city where she'd once mopped floors in silence, her nameplate reading Chief of Emergency Medicine, San Diego VA Hospital. Master Sergeant Chen, Maria's father, recovered fully, his daughter visiting monthly to bring photographs of his grandchildren, to thank the woman who knelt on concrete while 20 doctors walked away. And on the night shift at Seattle General, the same hospital that had once elevated Dr. Ashford to prominence, a man in a security guard uniform checked badges at the employee entrance. His name tag read Security Personnel. His face had aged 15 years in 6 months. He wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Every Tuesday at exactly 11 p.m., Elena consulted on complex trauma cases at Seattle General, and she made absolutely certain to enter through the main employee entrance. Tonight she approached the security checkpoint, her major's oak leaf pin gleaming on her white coat collar. Her credentials read Chief of Emergency Medicine, VA Hospital San Diego. Dr. Ashford sat behind the desk, and his hand shook as he scanned her badge. "Good evening," she said, her voice the voice she'd buried for 4 years, not the voice of a frightened nurse, but the voice of someone who'd brought soldiers home from Helmand Province under fire. He nodded, silent, unable to meet her eyes. She walked past him toward the trauma bay, then paused and turned back. Her hand brushed the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one Master Sergeant Chen had given her, his old 3rd Special Forces Group patch, the one he wore before shrapnel and bureaucracy and 20 doctors tried to erase him too. "You were right about one thing," she told Dr. Ashford, her voice calm and measured. "I do remember that moment differently than you do. You remember firing a nurse. I remember the moment I decided some fights are worth surfacing for." She continued down the corridor toward the trauma bay where new residents waited to learn field medicine from a woman who'd lived it in the dark and came back when it mattered most. The hospital doors closed behind her with the soft hiss of pneumatic seals, and in the security station, a man who'd once controlled an entire surgical department now checked badges for minimum wage and watched the woman he'd tried to destroy walk deeper into the light. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, hit that subscribe button. Comment below, what would you have done in Elena's position? And like this video so more people see that true heroism walks among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark.